Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Catherine and Marianne. I'm thrilled to be the first live one that you've had in over a year. I know it. And I will be looking forward to meeting and greeting everyone. I'm fully vaccinated, so I will be safe, but it'll just be a real pleasure to see people again. And I'm going to share my screen and bring up a few slides, just to give you an idea of what's in the book and some of the liberties that I've taken with the story. Now, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of Thomas Hart Benton, who, let me see if I can get this to go forward. Here we go. Who taught at the Art Students League from 1926 until 1935. I was a student at the Art Students League myself. I'm dating myself here. The president of the league came to the Pollack House last year, just as a coincidence, and she introduced herself and said that she was the president. And I said, oh, that's funny. I've just written a book about the Art Students League. And she said, I can get you Jackson Pollock's registration card, Lee Krasner's registration card, and your registration card. So they have everything digitized. So she sent it to me. I studied painting, drawing, and composition with the Thomas Fogarty Jr. and fashion illustration with Dagmar Freuchen. She was a real character. And she is, in fact, a character in the book. I tried to use as many real characters and real places as I could because I felt that that would give it more of an authentic air. But I did make some changes just for the sake of the plot. For one thing, I'm sure some of you of a certain age will remember the Horn and Hardart Automat on 57th Street. Well, I actually moved it one block west. It was between 6th and 7th, and I moved it over between 7th and 8th so that it would be opposite the Art Students League because I needed to have the action take place between those two buildings. So that was one little thing I did. The other was I moved Thomas Hart Benton's retrospective from 1989 at the Whitney Museum to 1967 because I needed him to be in New York in 1967 and I needed to give him a reason to come to New York. He was based in Kansas City. And there is old Tom. I really did a hatchet job on him, I have to tell you. Although he kind of did a hatchet job on himself because he was in life a very cantankerous character and a very polarizing figure. The painting that you see here, Retribution, was part of a mural cycle, a proposed mural cycle that was never created. He did all these studies for it. This one, I believe, is in the Kansas City, no, it's in the Nelson Atkins. But when he taught at the League, he was one of those people who collected acolytes and had supporters and detractors who were very vociferous on both sides. His politics had swung from being very left-wing to being very right-wing, and he was very anti-modern art. But by the time Jackson Pollock studied with him in 1930, he was really coming into his own, and by the mid-30s, he was probably the most famous artist in the United States. He had been doing a series of murals. You can see here 3 examples. The one on the top is from the New School for Social Research. This is just part of a larger cycle. The murals are no longer there. They're actually now in the Metropolitan Museum. And Pollock was just beginning to study with him when these murals were painted. And although he was too green to actually be able to do any work as an assistant, he was a helper. And also this figure right here, the steel worker, Jackson Pollock posed for that figure. Down here we have the murals that he did for the Whitney Museum in its original building on 8th Street. And this was called The Arts of Life in America, and it's now in the New Britain Museum of American Art. And down here, the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, 1933, he did this for the Indiana Pavilion, and it's now in the Indiana State House. This is actually oh, it's about 260 feet long. This is two separate panels that I'm showing you. So it's a history of the state. And he was also the very first artist to be featured on the cover of Time magazine. So here we are, 1934. Benton is extremely well known nationally, and he was teaching at the Art Students League. But in 1935, he left. He went to the Kansas City Art Institute, moved back to his native Missouri, and lived there for the rest of his life, although every summer he would go to Martha's Vineyard. But I have him come back to New York in 1967 in order to kill him. I'm sure he won't mind. He's already dead. He did, in fact, die in 1975 in his studio in Kansas City. But I wanted someone as contentious as Benton to be the protagonist, or I guess the antagonist in a way. But he was not at the Art Students League when I said he was, but the league itself is a very important locale in the story. It really has a personality. And I was so thrilled when I went back there to do research that it has changed so little over the years. It's over the decades. It was founded in 1875, and it moved into the building that it is in now in the late 19th century. But the atmosphere, the studios, the whole mise en scène is just so amazingly as I remembered it, even from my teenage years. And in that respect, I really enjoyed going back in time, but not that far back, 1967, but far enough so that I could bring in all of the social and political issues that were roiling around at the time. Pop art was coming into its own. The Vietnam War protests were just heating up. So this is the backdrop against which the plot is set. Here are some of the cast of characters. These are the real ones. I, of course, invented a number of characters to actually be the people who investigate the crime. Thomas Hart Benton was there teaching at the same time as Edward Lanning, it's this fellow here, was a student and also briefly taught at the League. And then he came back and taught again in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He was a real fixture there. Excuse me. Charles Alston was also there at the same time. And later, Raymond Briennin, who was here, and well, Brackman was also there in the 30s. So a lot of these teachers, these professors were there for the long term and really were in the, on the faculty in 1967. I was very fortunate. Stephanie Cassidy, who is the archivist of the Art Students League, provided me with digital copies of the bulletins from the years in question. And so I was able to know who was teaching when and use actual classes as the setting for the action. It didn't actually tell me which classroom they were in. That part I made up, but they were definitely in the building when this action took place. And Lanning was responsible in my story for inviting Benton to come back to the League, knowing that he was going to have this retrospective at the Whitney, and called him up and invited him to come by and just pay a visit. And Benton obliges. So when he gets there, he comes on very strong. He makes a real entrance. He's wearing his hillbilly outfit, and he starts looking around the room and complaining about anti-war protesters. He's very pro-Vietnam War. And then Lanning says, well, you know, would you give us the benefit of your thoughts about what the other artists, what the students are doing? So I'm going to read a little section from that, which gives you an introduction to Benton and his personality and his character. And I will also forewarn you that Benton used some very colorful language. He was known to have a very salty tongue. So any of you who have tender sensibilities, you will have to put your hands over your ears at a certain point. So he's already given his diatribe about the war. Anyway, says Benton, striding toward the center of the room, his heavy boots resounding on the bare wood floor, I'm not here to talk politics, don't want to get riled up. Truth is, I'm feeling nostalgic. Ain't been back to this drafty old barn in decades. It's over 30 years since I packed up and put New York behind me with no regrets. But me and the boys, we had some great times here. Yes, sir. Great times in and out of class. His gaze softened for a moment as he reflected. The bluster returned quickly. Speaking of class, let's see if Ed here has managed to knock any of his wisdom into you. He approached one of the painters, a man in his late 20s whose canvas was well advanced. Too flat, he barked. Gesturing at Wally, that's the model, he continued, that fellow is made of three-dimensional flesh and blood. Solid muscle and bone. You've turned him into a paper cutout. The painter, who was no novice, defended his approach. I wasn't aiming for a literal depiction, Mr. Benton. I'm interested in the relational planes, the intersecting forms, the... Bullshit, roared Benton. You sound like a fucking cubist. I got that nonsense out of my system before you were sucking your mother's tit. Warmed over Parisian modernism is a dead end, totally irrelevant. It's empty. It has no meaning or purpose beyond aesthetics. American art should deal with reality, real life, real people, and appeal to ordinary folks, not to dipshit collectors and the Nancy boys who run the museums. Climb down from your ivory tower and come back to earth, sonny. Grabbing the startled painter by the arm, Benton pulled him toward the model stand and mounted the platform, dragging the man along with him. Feel this thigh, Benton demanded, pushing the student's hand onto Wally's leg. Unlike your pathetic painting, it's real. It has pulse. It has strength. Wally winced, and the muscles in his jaw visibly tightened, but he remained still as Benton ran the student's fingers up and down his leg. See what I mean? Feel that bump here and the hollow there. Go back and paint that. Now the whole class was startled. Lanning often pointed out anatomical details on his models, but he never actually touched them, whereas Benton thought nothing of manhandling them. Lanning was reminded of a quip from his student days. Benton's models better not be ticklish. I got that little tidbit from the biography of Benton by Justin Wolfe. I read a number of books in preparation, including both of Benton's memoirs. They're sort of autobiographical studies. One is called An American in Art, was published in 1937, and then An Artist in America was published in 1967, I think it was. But then his rounds completed, Benton swaggered toward the door, surveying the room again, and shook his head. Well, Ed, you've got your work cut out for you. I don't see a winner in the bunch. I'm not ready to give up on them just yet, Tom, and I hope you don't mind my disagreeing with you about their potential. That got another scowl and snort from Benton, but Lanning continued. I seem to remember that you had a few unpromising students who went on to make names for themselves in the art world. I can think of one in particular. He grinned widely, and instead of taking umbrage, Benton let out a guffaw. Ha! You got me there, Ed. Yeah, I have to admit, Jack Pollock didn't have much going for him in the beginning. Couldn't draw worth shit, but by God, he worked at it. Never missed a life class, studied the old masters, even made clay models like I did to get a feel for the volumes and masses. He had such a desperate need to learn that I was sympathetic, and I flatter myself that I gave him confidence to stick with it. No doubt about that, Lanning agreed. He told me himself that he'd have been lost without you. He was lost, said Benton, a lost soul. He only found himself in his painting, and when he stopped painting, it was the end of him. He shook his head and made for the exit. Well, Tom, I'm sure the class is grateful for your guidance, said Lanning rather lamely as he opened the door for Benton, who left without another word. So that's our introduction to Tom. And let me just move ahead here. Raymond Brienen features very heavily because by complete coincidence, as I was looking up information on the various professors or instructors, as they're called at the League, I found this tidbit online about Rhiannon having painted a mural in Skokie, Illinois, which was censored. It was painted for the Public Works of Art project, which is a predecessor of the WPA. And I thought, this is perfect because Benton was in Chicago working on the mural for the Indiana Pavilion at exactly the same time. So why don't I make him responsible? And then that'll give Rhiannon a motive for revenge. So Benton is killed, or I have him killed, in Studio 9, which was his old studio. And Rhiannon teaches the Wednesday class in that studio. Rhiannon was born in Russia, emigrated to the United States in 1925. So he arrives at the studio expecting to teach his 7 o'clock class, only to find the New York City police inspector, Jacob Kaminsky, who was actually modeled on a real inspector from a slightly earlier era. And Kaminsky explains that Benton's body was found inside the studio. "You joke," blurted an astonished Rhiannon. "So little man's big mouth is now silent. There will be few tears, I fancy. I will shed none." This remark alerted Kaminsky. "You were not a fan of Mr. Benton's then?" Disregarding the consequences, Rhiannon began to elaborate his grievances against the late artist, which dated back 3 decades. In 1934, he said he was living in Chicago, where his family had emigrated from Russia after the revolution. With the economy in the dumps, there were few prospects for young artists. He had just turned 25 and was not long out of art school, but the New Deal had come to the rescue. The Public Works of Art project, which Jerry will definitely recognize what I'm talking about here, a federal government employment program, hired him to paint a mural in the library of Skokie School in Winnetka. Inspired by the Mexican muralists and flush with youthful enthusiasm, he chose the idealistic theme, "Give us the unity of men and we shall build a new world." The subject matter, which had been approved by the school board and the art project staff, reflected the Roosevelt administration's aim of commissioning optimistic public artworks to counter the national malaise. The program also kept the artists off the relief rolls by giving them something productive to do. Rhiannon's work was almost finished when Thomas Hart Benton showed up at Skokie School. Thanks to the national publicity generated by his latest mural, a sweeping historical panorama of the state of Indiana for the pavilion at the Century of Progress Exposition in Chicago, where he was holding court, he was the most famous artist in the country. Thinking his populist views would make him sympathetic and willing to lend his endorsement to the cause, the Regional Art Commission Art Project Administration invited him on a tour of the public works they were sponsoring. Benton took one look at Rhiannon's mural and pronounced it aesthetically derivative and politically socialistic, suggesting that the Russian-born artist was foisting communist propaganda on innocent school children. As he was later told, Benton turned the school board against the painting. What they had once considered uplifting and inspirational was now deemed sinister and threatening. And that's actually a quote from the news report. No sooner had it been unveiled than it was whitewashed. "Thanks to Benton, my mural was destroyed," fumed Rhiannon, still boiling mad more than 30 years later. "Where is body? I want to spit on it." "Now take it easy, Mr. Rhiannon," cautioned Kaminsky. "Your attitude does you no credit, and in fact puts you in a bad light, even more so considering the murder weapon. It was your fancy knife that did him in." "Splendid," thundered Rhiannon. "Kinzel is perfect weapon for revenge." So there we have Rhiannon, a colorful character in his own right. He was known as the mystic of Chicago. He painted rather fanciful, imaginary scenes, sort of semi-surrealistic. But so he was just tailor-made. In fact, of course, he and Benton probably never met. A couple of more other real characters who play important roles. Stuart Clonus, who was the director of the Art Students League, who was practically born there. But all of these people, by the way, even the administrators and the people who kind of play peripheral roles, actually went to the Art Students League. But both Goodrich and Clonus did. And I was really amazed to find how many people, even one of the characters who was involved in the war protests was an Art Students League alumnus. So it was amazing to me as I did my research to see how far the tentacles of the League has spread. But Clonus and Goodrich both are important pivotal figures in the way the plot develops. And of course, both of them are real people. So, of course, is Andy Warhol. And of course, in 1967, the factory was going strong. Warhol was at the top of his game. And this entourage that, as you can see, talk about colorful characters, they don't get any more eccentric than that. But I wanted to have the pop artists involved because of Benton's populism, and this kind of flew in the face of his brand of American scene painting, because in his estimation, pop art kind of bastardized what he was trying to achieve. It created a whole different definition of popular art. So I'm going to read a little section about when the fictional detective, Angelo Valentino, who was nicknamed Chic because of his resemblance to his namesake, goes to investigate Warhol's factory in search of a woman who threatened Benton at the Art Students League. The Warhol group turns up at the Whitney. I'm sorry, he threatened him at the Whitney, rather, not the Art Students League. They went there to see the exhibition, and they created a scene. Benton was in the gallery and told them to pipe down. And they said, "Who the hell are you?" And things kind of went downhill from there. And one of the group threatened Benton. And in the story, the woman who does threaten him is Valerie Solanas, who turned out to shoot Warhol the following year in reality. But she was a fringe member of his circle, and she had an organization called SCUM, which stood for the Society for Cutting Up Men. So she definitely had this idea of going in the night with a 6-inch blade and decimating the entire male population. That was her manifesto. So of course that fit right in very nicely with this knifing that happens to Benton. So to find out more about this person who made a scene at the Whitney but wasn't identified, Chic goes to the factory because all he knows about her is that she's part of the Warhol group. So he goes up to the factory, which, as you can see from this photograph, it shows you what it looked like in 1967. This is when it was on 47th Street, the first factory, covered in tin foil and silver paint, and just a very unusual environment. So Warhol is there, and people came and went. You know, it was just Liberty Hall. People just, whether they knew them or not, they just wandered in, wandered out. So Warhol spots Chic and cuts short his conversation on the phone and goes to greet the handsome newcomer. "Hi," he said amiably, "can you give me a hand over here?" He turned and walked the unidentified visitor to where two young men were manipulating a large silk screen onto a sheet of canvas laid on the floor. He pointed to one end of the canvas. "Grab hold of that end and pull it straight, will you?" he asked. "I don't mind folds, but I can't stand wrinkles." She crouched down and did as instructed, and the screen was positioned on the flattened canvas. He and Warhol stood back and watched as one of the assistants poured black ink onto the screen and another fetched a squeegee. With one man on each side, they pulled the tool over the surface and forced ink through the screen. "Now hold that end again, please," said Warhol, and Chic grabbed the canvas as the assistants raised the screen to reveal a portrait of the art dealer Sidney Janis, another of the prescient engineers who drove the Pop Art Express. His 1962 New Realists exhibition, which included Warhol's 200 Campbell soup cans, had helped launch the movement. And as a matter of fact, just as an aside, Warhol actually did do a portrait of Sidney Janis in 1967, and it was exhibited at the Pollack Krasner House a few years ago. The assistants tacked the canvas on the wall to dry, and Warhol studied it approvingly. "Wow, that's great," he said. "Let's do another one on a different background." He turned to Sheik. "What's your favorite color?" "What's yours?" he counted. "Green, like money," said Warhol. "Okay," said Sheik, "let's do green." A new canvas was laid down, and one of the assistants applied a coat of bright green acrylic paint. "Give it half an hour to dry," Warhol advised. "How about some Coke while we wait?" Sheik wasn't sure if he meant a liquid or a powder, but he went along. "Sure," he said. Warhol led his helpers to an elderly fridge in one corner and fished out 4 bottles of Coca-Cola. The band was also taking a break. The Velvet Underground are rehearsing on the other side of the loft. The band was also taking a break for refreshments, not soft drinks. Warhol made use of an antique wall-mounted opener and handed the bottles around. They pulled up some chairs and toasted the new portrait. "I think Sidney will love it," Warhol remarked. "Don't you think he has a nice face? I want to do a whole series of him." Sheik had no idea who Sidney was, but he figured, knowing Warhol's preoccupation with celebrities, that he must be someone important. He decided to use Sidney as an opening line to what he hoped would be an informative conversation about the Benton incident. "I think I recognize him," he lied. "Wasn't he at the preview reception for the Thomas Hart Benton show at the Whitney?" "Oh, I don't know. He could have been," said Warhol. "I wasn't there. I got the invitation, but I get so many I can't keep track. But Rodney and I and some of the gang went to see it a couple of weeks ago." "What did you think of it?" prompted Sheik. "Oh my God," chimed in Rodney, one of the 2 assistants. "It was a fiasco." "Really? What was wrong with it?" "Well, actually, we hardly got to see the paintings because no sooner did we go in than we ran into Benton himself and he made a scene in the gallery. Everybody got freaked out and we had to leave." Sheik pretended to look startled. "Was that you guys? I heard about that from a friend of mine who's a guard there. What happened to set him off?" "Well, confidentially, it was all Candy's fault," said Rodney, not so confidentially, directing his remarks to the room in general. Andy was admiring a painting of a nude woman, and Candy announced rather too loudly that she had a much better body than that slut, and she'd pose for naked for Benton anytime he liked, and give him a blowjob if he wanted one. Of course, Candy didn't know he was standing right there. Thinking this might be the woman who threatened Benton, Sheik asked, "Who's Candy?" "Me, that's who," came a voice from across the room, where the party in question was having her elaborate coif expertly styled by Billy Name, the hairdresser and studio manager who was responsible for the factory's silver lining. Candy Darling rose from the chair in a huff of offended dignity and marched over, powder puff mules clacking, to confront them, hands on hips. "He really was very impolite to me, you know. Instead of insulting me, he should have taken me up on both offers." Apparently news of Benton's death hadn't reached the factory. "Just think, if he paints me in the nude, he'd have a whole new career." She shrugged off her kimono to reveal herself in all her manly glory. From the neck down, she was a he, and a quite well-endowed one at that. So that's the factory. So we also have the War Resistors League, which is actually the oldest anti-war organization in the United States, and the backdrop of Vietnam War resistance. New York City was a real hotbed, as you can see from the publicity photograph, and 1967 was really just beginning to heat up, and 68, of course, was when it all blew up. And these are some of the locales. The War Resistors League was in that building on 17th Street, right off Union Square. And the Greenwich Village Peace Center, which was also heavily involved in anti-war protests and in organizing people leaving the country because of the draft. That was in the Washington Square Methodist Episcopal Church, behind one of those. I couldn't find out exactly which of the two red doors. It was either this one or that one, but it was in the basement of the church. And Rudy's Bar and Grill, where one of the suspects works as a busboy, is indeed still there. And it is remarkably unchanged, although of course the prices have indeed gone up since that time. But it's one of the great old New York City watering holes. And the rumor was that it got the first liquor license after the repeal of Prohibition. And it still has the same 1930s bar and the wonderful old sign as well. I don't think the pig was there in 1967. And a few more of the colorful locales that are featured importantly in the book. Max's Kansas City, which is right north of Union Square. I have an important scene take place there because it was where the Warhol crowd hung out after they finished doing whatever they did at the factory. And I couldn't resist throwing in the bitter end because my college roommate and I actually performed there in their hootenannies. And Benton was not only a folk music fan, but he was actually, oh, thank you, Marianne. That's probably more applause than I got when I was on stage. But Benton had a jug band. They used to meet at his home and play. He played the mouth organ and other people played the guitar. Pollock played the Jew's harp. And these were Friday night gatherings, and he actually made a record album of his informal concerts. So he could very well have shown up at the bitter end. And I actually have it happen on the night of Woody Guthrie's death. So there's a big concert, a big memorial concert, and Benton shows up. And the Whitney Museum, of course, is where he has his retrospective. And it had only just recently opened in the Marcel Breuer building on Madison Avenue. It had moved uptown in 1965. So, or was it 66? Anyway, right around that time. So this was quite a novelty. And where else do we have some? I wanted to include as many real places and real people as I could, just because I felt it helped to establish the atmosphere and make the story more believable. Well, these are some of the books that I researched with. Wonderful memoir of The Bitter End by Paul Colby, who took over from the original owner of Weintraub. But these books really gave me important background. I mean, you know, I've probably forgotten most of what I learned, and these just kind of re-stimulated my memories of that period because I, unlike many people who lived through the 60s, I do in fact remember them. But perhaps not in the kind of detail that I needed for a believable mise-en-scène in the book. Which, of course, you can buy at Canio's. And as Marianne said, I will be there tomorrow signing, or was it Catherine? I forget, but whichever of you told us, I will be there from 2 to 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. So if anyone would like to come by, I would be more than happy to sign the book for you. Does anybody have any comments or questions? I'd be very happy to answer.
Thank you, Helen. That was really phenomenal. If anyone has a question.
Catherine, can I speak?
Please.
Catherine, can I speak? Helen, that was absolutely fabulous. I don't have a question for you, unfortunately, but
your comment is very welcome. Thank you.
No, I'm really looking forward to reading the book because, you know, like you, I, you know, was a 60s person and did a lot of demonstrating, and all those places you mentioned, I remember all of them. So I'm very, 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 very much looking forward to reading your book. But thank you. It was a fabulous presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.
See if anyone else has a question, just raise your hand. Marianne?
So, Helen, absolutely extraordinary presentation, and you are deeply immersed in this art world. You've done oodles of research, reading books to refresh your own memory. So, can you say a word or two then about the writing process? So, how do you take the leap from the different areas of research that you embarked on, and you confront, the story? How does that go for you?
Well, it sort of started out with, when if you're researching a subject. I mean, I've been an art historian for many years, and sometimes something in the story itself just would trigger my imagination. Like with an Exquisite Corpse, I thought, what if there was a real corpse? An Exquisite Corpse is a parlor game. It's played on paper. It's just a fun thing that the surrealists invented to amuse themselves. But what if we actually had somebody decked out like an Exquisite Corpse? Who would have done that? And so then you just kind of take off from there. And of course, with Pollock, with the second book, An Accidental Corpse, the story of Pollack's death is so well known. And then I thought, well, what if the other person who was killed was actually dead before the car crash? What if that wasn't how she died? Just like it sort of came to me as I was musing about, I don't know, just thinking about the story itself. It's just a twist on what really would have happened. So I guess it's just an imaginary thing that if it takes off, if I then begin to think, oh yeah, I can do something with it, then I use the historical background as the setting in which to make the fiction happen. And I started off by having two police people, because one of them is female, who have to investigate the original crime, meet and fall in love and marry and have a son who features in the second book. And then he becomes the primary figure in the third book. So he grows up, because each one is set in a different decade. The first one is 1943, second one's 1956, this one's 1967, and the next one will be 1976.
Ooh, there is a next one.
Well, actually, there's one after that too, 1987. I'm working.
Oh, brilliant! Oh, I was hoping that this was not a trilogy. This is ongoing. But
stop me before I kill again.
But I love, it's the great what if. It's really your imagination fired up, and you spoke about some wonderful sort of coincidences that were additional sparks. But thank you. I appreciate your response.
Well, of course, I have not invented this genre. This is
right.
Historical fiction is a long-standing tradition. But I think of E.L. Doctorow doing Ragtime, and that is sort of the model that I followed, where you have a fictional character, Coalhouse Walker, and then the story revolves around him.
Great, thank you.
Nice
Roger,
hand
please.
up.
Yeah. Roger, just unmute first. Mary and Roger, just unmute. There you go.
Sorry about that. I have been very, very enjoyable, Helen.
Thank you.
So let me ask you one question, which is probably fairly pedantic. What did you think of? Do you think of your plot all the way through before you start writing, or does the plot sort of emerge as you're writing? In other words, do you think of the murderer and all the rest of it beforehand, or during it?
In the first case, the first book, I did. I knew who the murderer was, and what I didn't know was how to make it believable. I read a lot of mysteries, and sometimes I find that there's some coincidence or there's something that just doesn't quite gel, and you think, oh, that's not working for me anyway. And I guess it's sort of, I thought, well, maybe I could do it better, or I could do it more believably. And that part of it was a little difficult. I knew who I wanted it to be, but I didn't know how to get there. And literally, I got there as I was falling asleep. You know, it's such a cliche, such a cliche. But it's true. I actually, as I'm dozing off, oh, right, that's how I can do it. But with the second one, The Accidental Corpse, I also knew who it would be because it had to be that person. There was no other way to do it. And with the third one, I didn't quite know who it would be because I thought that Briennon was so perfect. He had such a perfect motive and he had the opportunity and he had the weapon, you know, it was like he was the perfect one, but then he was too perfect.
Mhm.
But you could make the obvious one actually be the killer. Go off on a whole bunch of different tangents and wind up back at the guy who should have done it and actually did. So I'm not going to tell you whether he was in fact the one who did it, but his character and his circumstances were so right for it that he was the obvious choice.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? And while you're thinking about it, I just want to say it's very satisfying, Helen, how you have woven in so many different artists who we know, if not by their work in detail, by their name, and then with the city, which is of course always a wonderful character in any work of fiction. It's just great to be able to have all of those touchstones throughout the whole book. So
Well, I did work hard to get that right. And one of the finest compliments I had on the first book was when someone who had actually known some of these people, I mean, this is set in 1943, so these are the artists who were more or less dead, you know, by the time I came along, but who said to me that she heard their voices.
Oh,
And I thought that was very satisfying. And then in the second book, of course, it's set out here in East Hampton. This is where Pollock was killed. So I wanted to be sure to get the Bonnick setting right. So I asked Prudence Carabine, who's a 12th generation Bonnicker, if she would read it for me, and if I was embarrassing myself on the Bonnick side, if she could just, you know, give me a few pointers. And the only thing she said was one character was talking about the women in the car, and he said the two young women, and she said no, he would have said two young ladies. So that was very helpful. But she said no, she felt that I had gotten the tone correct, and you know, that is important to me. I don't want to falsify the real part. I just want to falsify the false part.
quite a delicate dance, you know, and line to sort of to parse in order to
Well,
get.
somebody once told me that they were reading the book with holding it in one hand and Googling with the other to find out who was real and who wasn't. And you know, if I say, like I said with Fred Olam, he's the guy who gets killed on page 1 in the first book, and he did not die until 1982, and this is 1943, so it's 40 years difference. And she said, no, it was a he. He said, I was sure Wilfred Olam lived longer than that. I said, yes, you're right, he did. I just needed him to die because he was such a perfect character. He was Cuban, and on his father's side, he was Chinese, and on his mother's side, he was Afro-Cuban. So that allowed me to take the story into Chinatown and into Spanish Harlem. So
Wow.
I could, you know, make a very colorful setting.
Books might be interesting.
That sounds fantastic. And can you give us a hint as to who the next books will be about, or is that something you have to keep in the can?
Well, I haven't, it hasn't been accepted for publication yet. So I guess I probably should hold on for a while.
yeah.
Well,
Well, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. I
Yeah.
really appreciate hearing that.
Yeah. I think I'll come by tomorrow.
Great. I look forward
I
to
live
it.
right down the street.
Oh, well, then you have no excuse not to.
No excuse, right?
Yes, everyone is
What
welcome.
time is it again? 2:00?
2 o'clock from 2 to 3:30.
Okay.
Everyone is welcome, and all three books make a great package to have either on your shelf or to give to a friend.
Yes.
I see Kimberly has her hand up, so please.
I just wanted to thank, I wanted to thank you because I found it really intriguing. I'm not around, so I can't come by tomorrow, but I'm truly looking forward to reading it.
Thank you so much, Kimberly.
You're welcome. Pleasure to see you.
And Kimberly, when will you be back?
Mexico, everybody.
Yeah, we hope you'll be back soon.
Yeah, I'll be back within the next few weeks.
Okay,
Great.
great. So you give me the occasion to let people know that if they can't come tomorrow and if they're not in the area, but they would, like to support the bookstore, and of course, Helen as the author, that we now have an online presence with bookshop.org. So if you're away and you want to support us, the link is in the chat right now. It's simply bookshop.org/shop/caniosbooks, and anything you purchase there, when you mention our store's name, we get credit for. So just to know that that's out there. So
I hope you'll sign some extra ones so that when we go by that they'll actually be signed copies.
Oh, I'll be happy to do that.
Great.
yeah, always happy to arrange for that when you get back, Kimberly. So safe travels.
Thank you, dear.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. Big thanks, another round of applause for Helen. Great presentation.
Helen, it was terrific.
Oh, thank you, Wendy.
Great.
You
Look
know,
forward to seeing you.
Good to see you both too.
Yeah, I just want to put a shout out to Helen and to all authors, coming out with books over the last year. It's been a really challenging time for them to be able to get their books into the public hands. So that's why we're happy to offer this opportunity for Helen, and really so thrilled that she'll be our first sort of in-person writer to be with us tomorrow. So we'll look forward to that. And Marianne, I don't know if you want to close with a few words.
Oh, I'm just so excited to have this book. It's already been selling, Helen, and I'm glad to know that there are some more coming along. Each one is so interesting and fascinating and so well done. So thank you, Helen, for all your good work, and thanks to our community for joining us. I do want to just mention, of course, if you're coming by tomorrow, we are still requiring that you wear a mask. As I said, most of the event will be outdoors, but even so. So please, even though those of us who are vaccinated, we're still taking the precautions. So we're really excited about having you, Helen, tomorrow at the shop. But thanks so much for tonight's wonderful presentation, and we look forward to seeing all of you very soon. So
Thank you very much, Marianne and
Right.
Catherine.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Okay,
Yeah.
see you tomorrow.
Ciao.
Have a good night, everyone.